Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum dears. In this video we will be discussing the essay Can the Subaltern Speak, written by Gayatri Spivak. Gayatri Spivak is a Bengali American post-colonial critic and a professor at Columbia University. She has translated the Derrida's work of grammatology, which shows that she is operating at a high theoretical level. Her essay Can the Subaltern Speak was published in 1988. And it is one of the significant work in the field of post-colonial studies, cultural studies, and feminist scholarship. When the student hear the word subaltern, they ask, what does actually the subaltern mean? The subaltern word was first used by Gramsci, an Italian Marxist thinker who used it for someone of a lower rank. But Spivak uses this word in a very specific way. For Spivak, subaltern is anyone outside the structure of power, the colonized, the oppressed, those whose voices are not systematically heard even when they try to speak. So they are not just poor and powerless and outside the power structure. The voice of these people are also not heard, and they do not have their voice. So the main question in this essay that Spivak asks is, can the subaltern speak? And if they do, is there anyone truly listening to them? But before Spivak answers her question, she refers to the two giants in the European philosophical history, Foucault and Deleuze. They both were progressive thinkers, and they were against the power. They believed that the ordinary people can speak for them, and this is what they say. The masses know what they want, and they don't need someone to speak for them. But Spivak highlights an issue with this claim, and she says that when these philosophers say that the masses can speak for them, they mean the European society, the European culture. And they ignore the third world countries, the people who suffer by the hands of capitalism and colonialism. Spivak calls this sanctioned ignorance. Sanctioned ignorance does not mean that you forget something accidentally. It means that the structure of your thinking does not allow you to think outside certain things, even if you consider yourself a progressive or a radical philosopher. It is like wearing glasses that can correct your vision in Europe but blinds you to the rest of the world. So Spivak points out that even the radical and famous Western philosophers can reinforce the power structure they challenge simply by ignoring the rest of the world. This is very important to be kept in mind while doing post-colonial research. Then Spivak moves forward and discusses the issue of presentation or representation, and she refers to the Russian great philosopher and thinker Karl Marx. Karl Marx and the German philosophy use two different words for the representation. The first, Vertreten. It means speaking for someone. For example, a lawyer representing you in a court of justice, or a political leader speaks on behalf of the voters. This is political representation. The second, Testelen. It means speaking about something or representing or portraying something. For example, a painter paints the picture of someone, or the novelist writes about the sufferings of the refugees in a novel. Looking at these two different versions of representation, Spivak highlights a very interesting point. She says that the European thinkers and philosophers usually confuses these two. They think that by writing about the suffering of the colonized people, by representing their struggles, by portraying these poor people in their academic texts, they are speaking for them politically. No, they are representing them, but they do not speak for them. It is just the description of the suffering of the poor and powerless subalterns. By describing someone does not mean giving him power. For example, we are writing a research paper or an essay about the suffering of a woman somewhere in a remote village. So, do we speak for her? Do we give her any power? No. Has her situation changed? No. But we have published our article. This confusion between describing and representing is referred to as paradoxical subject privileging by Spivak. The intellectual, the writer, becomes the hero of the text, while the subaltern remains silent. And one of the interesting concepts is epistemic violence. Epistemic is derived from epistemology, that means the study of knowledge. Violence here is used as non-physical violence, the intellectual violence. So epistemic violence means the systematic destruction of the local and indigenous ways of knowing and replacing them by Western frameworks. This is such an interesting point, replacing the local methods of knowing with Western frameworks. And Spivak gives a historical example from India. She writes that when the British wanted to govern the people of India, they wanted a legal system. So what did they do? They brought Hindu Brahmins, a prestigious class, and asked them to explain Hindu law from the ancient texts. Then the British codified and flattered all the complexities from the law and implemented it as Hindu law in India. The result was all the traditions, the different interpretations were erased, and one rigid legal system was imposed on Indians. And this was not for the benefits of the people of India, it was for the British administrative convenience. So the colonized people became the objects of law and not the subaltern of agency. They were not the agent of power, but the objects of law. The subalterns were not only silenced, they were transferred into legal artifacts to be managed, to be controlled, to be governed. This is epistemic violence, and it is still continued today. Whenever a dominant system dismisses a local or indigenous or any non-Western way of knowing or thinking, it is epistemic violence. Then Spivak turns to the issue of gender oppression, and she says, the male are silenced, but what about the women in post-colonial conditions? She writes that the women in such conditions are double marginalized. Spivak is of the view that the man faces only one kind of oppression from the imperialist or capitalist or colonial side, while the woman faces two issues. She is the victim of the capitalist or imperialist powers from the outside, while she is also the victim of the patriarchy inside her society. So it is a double marginalization. So Spivak writes her most quoted lines: between patriarchy and imperialism, the subject constitution and the object formation, the figure of women disappears, not into nothingness, but into violent shutting. Think of it like this. The third world woman is pulled out in two directions. Her society forces her to remain silent and obedient, while the imperialist and capitalist structures uses her labor and denies her legal status. She is the engine of production, but invisible in the discourse. She cannot win either way. And this brings us to the most critical part of this essay. The case of Rasmi Sati. In 1829, the British colonial government abandoned the tradition of sati, and they are of the view that we are saving Indian women from this barbarian act. This was the practice in which the widow would burn herself on her husband's funeral. On the surface, it looked a very humanitarian act, but Spivak highlights two very distinct patriarchal narratives, and in both of these narratives, women was completely absent and silent. The British narrative was that the white man is saving the brown men and women from the brown men, and the women in this situation, the widow, is to be rescued. She has no voice of her own. In the same way, just like in this narrative, where the women had no voice, the British patriarchal narrative was that the widow wants to die with her husband, and she is giving this sacrifice, and it is considered as a noble deed. Again, nobody asked the widow or the women. She is again silent and oppressed. Notice, in both the cases, the men are deciding what is better for the women, and thus they decide what is the meaning of death of a widow in such situation. What the women wanted herself was never a part of the debate in both the cases. And this is the most significant point in this essay. Spivak says that the woman has no voice for herself. The discourse has already decided who she is. Now Spivak gives the most deeply moving example to prove that this silence is not just historical, it is also structural. In 1926, an Indian woman, Bahadri, hanged herself in her family apartment in North Calcutta. She was a member of the group that was fighting the British colonialism, and she was given a task of a political assassination. But she was unable to do it, and she knew the consequences of not doing the task. So she decided to take her own life. But she did something remarkable. In her society, it was a narrative or an ideology that whenever an unmarried girl dies by suicide, it was considered that it is because of the illicit pregnancy or a shameful affair. So what she did, she tried to speak to her body that this act of suicide is not a shameful one, it is a political one. That is why she waited for her periods to begin before killing herself. And thus she wanted to speak to her body that I died on the grounds of political reasons. But no one understood what her body spoke. Her family recorded her death as a case of illicit love. And decades later, people were mocking this death as a shameful act. And nobody understood the political message in that death. The social discourse had no place for her message. So her message was distorted and represented in the existing ideological narrative. And this is Spivak's most ultimate proof. The subaltern cannot speak. Not because they cannot speak, but because there is no one true listening. So what does Spivak tells us in this essay? As a scholar, as a researcher, as a teacher, we need to understand this message. Her conclusion is an ethical challenge. She says, the problem is not solved by giving voice to the subaltern, because in this case, the intellectuals are placed again in the position of power. And as an intellectual, you are still deciding for the subaltern, and you decide what gets heard and how. So this is such an important message. We need to understand. She asks the intellectual to do two things. First, learn to unlearn your privilege. You must control your own sanctioned ignorance, because what you are not seeing is because of where you stand. Second, measures the silences. Instead of speaking for the subaltern or the silenced, learn to read the gaps, the things not said, the missing voices from the archives, and the broken circuits in the history. This is hard, not only hard, but an uncomfortable work. But it is the ethical responsibility of everyone who claims to study human experiences. Now, if you are a researcher, a scholar, a teacher, or a student of post-colonial studies or subaltern studies, this essay is not optional. It is essential. In the comments below, I want to hear from you. In your view, can the subaltern speak today? What has changed and what has not? If you found this video helpful, please share with your colleagues, friends, and fellows. Please like, share, and subscribe. Until next time, keep reading, keep questioning, and keep learning. Thank you.